Thank you all so much for being here today. My name is Olga Shurchkov, and I'm the faculty director of the Albright Institute. For those of you who may not be too familiar with the Albright Institute, it was established in honor of Secretary Albright to provide multidisciplinary programming on issues that are relevant to global affairs. The idea is to carry forward the legacy of Secretary Albright's spirit of collaboration, speaking across difference, and encouraging exploration. So today we're sort of in that last part, exploration, research. This event today is the culmination, essentially, of the new Albright Faculty Affiliates program that was established just last summer. It's a new faculty initiative to support and connect all faculty and researchers who work on topics of global importance. Currently, the funding for this program, comes from the Hewlett Grant, and we are extremely grateful to the previous faculty director of Albright, Stacy Goddard, for securing that funding for us. So today we're celebrating scholarship of this academic year's cohort of Albright Faculty Research Affiliates, and the student researchers who worked with them over the course of the year. They're in the audience, and they're going to be taking over the second part of the event, which will be the poster session. We structured the event to mimic key aspects of an academic conference, including a panel discussion with faculty and then a poster session that follows. I hope that everybody will stay around after the panel and go up to the student researchers and ask them questions about their research so that they can enjoy that experience and everybody can be in community together. I hope that you will enjoy learning about faculty research at Wellesley, and I hope that you might get inspired to join the Albright community in the future. So for students, what does that look like? We're going to be hiring a new cohort of student researchers for the next academic year, sometime at the very beginning of the next academic year. So watch out for calls for applications for that. Of course, we also have our flagship program in the winter session that we recruit for, so make sure that you take a look. For faculty, we have exciting opportunities as well. So we have this faculty affiliates program. The deadline for that for faculty is May 2nd, so if anybody is not affiliated already, please do consider it. And the form, the form is on the Albright Institute website under faculty affiliates. Anyway, without further ado, I'm going to be moderating this panel discussion. We have with us Dr. Faisal Ahmed from political science. We have Dr. Chipo Dendere, who is from Africana studies. We have Dr. Erzen Öncel from political science. We have Dr. Priscilla Torres from political science as well. And last but not least, Dr. Mustafaraj from computer science. Give them a big round of applause. Welcome, everyone. So I'm actually going to sit now, which I now sound very different. But anyway, so I think what we're going to do is we're just going to go down the line and start off by, talking a little bit about your general research agenda. So not necessarily the project that you worked, with the student on, but just more generally your research and how it relates to global affairs, why you're here as part of the Albright researchers. It doesn't really matter the order, but maybe we can start with, Faisal, maybe. Yeah, sure.
Hi, so my name is Faisal Ahmed. I work primarily in the area of international trade and finance, so studying how politics affects trade flows, capital flows, and sort of the effect of trade and capital on politics, primarily in developing countries. So for the past year, Riya and I have been working on a project that tries to examine how bureaucrats affect international trade. And we focus primarily on looking at diplomats and whether or not they facilitate trade. And so what we've done is we've collected data from the US Diplomatic Corps going back to 1776. So we've gotten information on every single ambassador that the US has had for over 200 years. And then we've taken down a bunch of their biographical information and things like that. And then we match that to historical trade data to get a sense of whether or not they actually matter in affecting trade flows. And so what we do is we look at sort of two potential roles. One is thinking about what happens when there's a vacancy. So the argument there is that when there's a vacancy, there's a reduction in diplomatic influence. And so what we identify using sort of standard like gravity models of international trade from international economics is that when there's a vacancy, there's a reduction in US trade. Then we also sort of borrow models from corporate finance that look at how CEOs affect firm performance, and we apply that framework in the context of trade, and we look at whether or not individual ambassadors affect trade flows, and we find evidence that they do there as well. So generally speaking, sort of like this project is part of a broader sort of research agenda of mine, looking at how bureaucrats within foreign policy agencies such as the US State Department, as well as sort of like the United Nations, affect sort of economic performance for many countries.
Thank you. Excellent. Yep, Dr. Torres.
So generally speaking, my research focuses particularly on peace building, peacekeeping, and gender and conflict. The particular paper presentation that I worked on with Riya, Kalra, and several other undergraduate research assistants basically explores what the effects of peace building are of different kinds on violence, particularly conflict-related violent outcomes. Kind of surprisingly, a lot of the literature reviews that do exist that summarize the scholarship in this area often focus on critical analyses of peace building in addition to focusing on other outcomes that aren't directly related to violence. So we kind of take this really simple premise and collected a slew of different studies. Riya was instrumental in helping to code a lot of these studies and create kind of a database for myself and for us to use to analyze this data. This work will be instrumental in helping me get my book project off the ground and running, which focuses a bit more concretely on the local sources of international peace building effectiveness kind of at the community level. So this is going to be pretty instrumental in that work. A lot of my work focuses kind of on the unintended consequences of international initiatives, particularly in the peace building space. And those things also often extend to gender as well. So it's just kind of a snapshot.
Okay, so this is Erzen Öncel. My work looks at how leadership and institutions function, and using a comparative and historical perspective. And broadly, I'm interested in two main questions, big questions. First, who actually makes up the leadership class, right? What kinds of identities and backgrounds do leaders have? And how much do they reflect the broader society? This is basically what we can summarize as, are we truly represented by the leadership class? And is policymaking inclusive of all groups? So this is my first big question in my research. And the second big question I have in my research is the leadership patterns. Things like how often elites changed, how long they stay in power, and when they become deeply entrenched in politics, and how those patterns relate to regime types and inclusion of marginalized communities, marginalized groups. And I do this through both political and civil society leaders. So I'm looking at both leadership class. And here with Rachel, what we have done is a part of the second big question that I've been just dealing with lately. So I'm looking into institutional change and political elite configuration, starting from Ottoman Empire till today, how different regime changes and ruptures, institutional ruptures, have affected elite turnover and leader tenure over time, and how we could just look into future and see how these institutional changes could just be effective over political landscape and political institutional functionings.
Awesome. Well, so far we had only political scientists speaking, and now we're going to have a computer scientist. And I think it's probably very interesting for everyone to hear, you know, the perspective that a STEM faculty member can bring in here into this Global Affairs Institute. So, any?
Okay, thank you, Olga. I'm Eni Mustafaraj in the computer science department. Indeed, it is odd that I'm the only non-political scientist in this space here, but maybe what explains that I'm here is that I had a very political upbringing. I was born in Albania, which was a totalitarian society for most of my life as a young person, and I grew up looking at propaganda all over. So you guys here, when you drive across the United States, you see the big advertising selling you stuff. But what I saw when I was growing up was these like photos of Karl Marx and Lenin and Stalin and a lot of politics. So I knew that you can shape the physical environment to turn it into a big propaganda space to shape people's values and ideas, and also to make visible certain things and then to hide others. And this was all by design. And therefore, in my life as an adult computer scientist, what I decided to do is to study online information environment, because environments shape who we are, and we now spend most of our times online, right? Like, yes, we have a beautiful campus, but I'm sure that most of us are mostly on our phones and our computers. And probably you think that, oh, what we see online is just like random stuff, you're searching for it, but not anymore. There are commercial platforms who own the information space and the entertainment space, and increasingly whatever we experience online is curated by their algorithms, and their algorithms are not neutral. They have encoded ideologies in them, and of course they are there to serve the purposes of the platforms that have invented and implemented these algorithms. And so what I do in my research is that we collect a lot of data. We audit platforms. We collect data because we want to see both the behavior of the algorithm, but also how algorithms have shaped the information flow, like who produces information, how visible that information is. And we do this particularly around election times, but also at other times all year long, but for different topics. But especially when there are elections, we are interested in seeing what is that the algorithms are surfacing when voters are searching for information online. Because as you know, whatever you see online, then you end up believing, especially if that is persistent, right? Like propaganda works very well because it's always, you see the same thing over and over, you're reading the same information from the same sources. And our poster will show you some of that.
Thank you. Makes a lot of sense. Actually, the connections are incredible, right? Because leadership, right? Well, the leaders could use propaganda, right? And in peacekeeping, and also in, of course, times of war, we could use propaganda. So I think you really fit into this group really well. you mask yourself into a social scientist. Excellent. Well, and Professor Dendere?
Thank you. Hi. You guys are so serious. I was just telling my students that Wellesley people are so serious. Oh my God. Okay. My work, I study African politics. I am fascinated by democracy in all of its variations, right? Its existence, its absence, the way people use social media, the way that authoritarian regimes manipulate language, all of this. My first book, which is coming out soon, and I hope my friends will host events for me on campus, studies what happens when people exit. So almost after every election, you'll hear people say, oh, my side didn't win, so I'm going to leave the country. Maybe some of you feel that way, that you want to exit whatever space you're in. And this book argues that when you exit, what happens is that the side that remains, that consolidates their views. But I will stop there because I actually want you to buy the book when it comes out. And this project with Sylvette, who's here, for me, it's a clear example of what teaching at Wellesley looks like for faculty. I had been thinking about teaching a class on the politics of food, but I'd never studied the politics of food before. And in the seminar on chocolate, my students and I were asking so many questions that I thought, well, this could be my other research agenda because I work at a liberal arts college and we can do whatever we like. Then I started to think, okay, who eats chocolate and where does chocolate come from? And I realized that there was quite a disconnect between the origins of chocolate and the people who consume it. The people that produce the product that gives us chocolate sometimes have never tasted chocolate. They don't know what chocolate looks like. And those of us who are consuming chocolate have no idea where chocolate comes from. So I really like this research project because it came out of the classroom. It came out of students asking questions. And like good Wellesley students, when they looked through my syllabus, they were so kind in telling me that, oh, these readings were terrible. They're so smart. And then it became, well, maybe I should write something. Yeah.
Wow. Well, exactly. Honesty sometimes leads to really good results. Yes. Thank you for these wonderful descriptions of your research. I mean, right. And research is so. Not everybody here is going to go get a PhD. Not everybody here, right, is going to go into academia. But I think it's a fascinating world. Academia is a fascinating world. And I think it's a world where creativity, you really have to open your mind up and come up with ideas. And so even though some of you already alluded to what motivates you to do your work, but I think I would love to hear a little bit more about like how you actually come up with ideas, what inspires you to pursue a particular idea. I think that could also be helpful for anyone pursuing any career, right? Is how do we pursue this particular path? Anybody, actually?
Well, in terms of leadership, I mean, studying leadership in political science, if you know the historiography of studying political science, you know that for most of the 20th century, political science really focused on institutions, systems, and structures rather than rulers. I mean, it was the beginning of the 20th century where it was just more about historical data about rulers only. And I mean, then we just passed this and it was just passé and we never just turned to leaders again. So the thinking that rules, not rulers, shape political outcomes, right? But in the last few decades, especially with the rise of strongman politics and democratic backsliding, we see that it's just a renewed interest in the role of leaders. So this just led me from an academic standpoint to just become passionate about studying leaders overall. And also on a personal level, my own experience has also driven this work, how I've seen how one-man rule and an extended tenure can transform institutions drastically, unexpectedly, restrict representation, and completely reshaped everything in society is something that has driven my work. So that makes all these questions not only theoretical and academic, but also very urgent, very real. And so that's just something that motivates all of us.
Thank you for that. And I think it's very personal for all of us, probably. But yeah, anybody else wants to add? Yeah.
So the study of African politics, I found that when you walk into the classroom and you ask students to tell you what comes to mind when you think about Africa, there are three things that students usually say. They think about poverty, they think about war, and sometimes they think about minerals and natural resources. And this is because the way that a lot of political scientists have approached writing about Africa is we study dictators, we study the wars on the continent and all of these things, but they don't study the nuance, right? So when you study American politics, you study the role of the economy. So how does the economy shape the way that people think? People study social media. How does social media impact the way that people respond to American politics? There are all of these range of things that people study. And for me, what fascinates me about studying African politics and then how I generate those questions is thinking about Africans as everyday, ordinary people. right? So when we think about the economy, how does the economy actually shape the way that Africans turn out to vote? And if you're reading traditional literature on African politics, you'll come out thinking, no, Africans don't care about the economy. They just care about the big men politics. And I think that's the wrong way to think about African politics. It's like, well, why is it that they're attracted to this particular big man? And so that's what I'm always doing in my work. So even the work on chocolate, when I was traveling in Ghana, and we went to all these farms, people would say, but why does it matter? Why does it matter that you study cocoa or cacao? And I think, well, it matters because if Africa produces the majority of natural resources in the world, ideally Africans should be benefiting financially from that, and that should reflect in how the politics is engaged. But it means that there is a gap somewhere, right, between the natural resources, whether we're thinking diamonds, gold, all of that, the money that is produced from that, and who makes the most profit, and then how Africans exist in their everyday spaces. So this poverty that people are so focused on, what is the root of this poverty? How do we explain it outside of things being done to Africans, but also thinking about how Africans are engaging with this community, with like this existence of resources that they have. So this farmer who's growing cacao, what are their views on that, right? And where it ends up. So I think that's the why for me. And just to point that, I think a lot of people start off with the methodology and they say, I am a quantitative scholar. So because I do this methodology, these are the questions that I ask. But for myself and my students, I think you think about what interests you, and then the methodology comes to you.
And this is up. Yeah.
I'll put a plug there for science fiction and speculative fiction, because that is actually something that reading a lot of fiction gives you ideas about the real world. But anyway, I'm a big sci-fi fiction, and if you see what's happening around right now, we have certain people in power, and the life that we are living right now is being shaped by the tech bros, as they are now known, right? And many of them got their ideas about what the world should look like by reading science fiction, but actually reading dystopian science fiction, and somehow they said that, oh no, like this looks great, right? And many of the things that we see right now is out of the playbook of some of those famous science fiction. Sorry, Vanya, you wanted to name something in particular?
I wonder if you could just chip in and ask a question. Right, so both of you actually bring a really, really important point that the environment shapes us, who we are. And you said that in the US we were focused on economy. Where I'm from Croatia, we were not focused on economy. It was more of something similar to what Annie had in Albania, right? So it's like very different sort of focus on the community and focus on equality and focus, it was very different than what, and you said also that but the question that I've said, like, how are the kids, for example, in Africa, being taught in school about the history of Africa, or what influences it? Because that's what also probably shapes, and then that particular view is then transplanted elsewhere about big dictators or whatever we are learning. So, for example, when I learned about the US, it was always focused on the economics, which was really interesting. So some of that learning that was like pushed in the US, that was translated about the US history and economy. It was through the economy. So I don't know, I really wanted to see your opinion about that.
So I should probably repeat that because I don't know if the video actually got all that. The Q&A is coming up, and we'll have a microphone coming around. There's no problem. So I think the question is about how location and particular culture shapes what we care about, like the economy versus, and what our children learning in schools, perhaps in Africa.
Right? Yeah, but am I answering now?
Yeah, you can answer. or you can.
Let me think about that. I have so many different thoughts.
Okay, wow. So we'll give Professor Dendere a little bit more time to think about it. But I want to ask the panel one last question, and then we'll open it up to more questions from the audience. My last question is just about working with students in particular, and what are the best parts, and also for the students who are interested in, getting that research job with faculty, like what advice would you give them? Anyone?
I'll start. Sorry. So it's been fantastic to get to work with undergraduate research assistants. It's really cool to get to see them learn and grow and actually develop tangible skills kind of separate from myself. I kind of give them a rough tutorial, but they really have to go through the trenches and kind of figure it out themselves. And so it's really rewarding to get to see them on this year-long journey and develop those skills. So that's been awesome, getting to see that from the outside. Advice that I would give students who are looking to work with faculty, if you have particular skills that you think would be an asset to your faculty member when you're approaching to them, I've done extensive literature reviews, I've written annotated bibliographies before, I have some statistics skills in these particular softwares. Being upfront about that is really helpful, so that way the professor can kind of figure out maybe which projects to place you on if they have a slot for an RA position. But on the flip side, if you don't have certain skills, if you're interested in developing particular skills and you know what those are, also be transparent about that as well. It's also really helpful. On the other side, because sometimes students approach faculty and just say, I want to be an RA, and then you're just like, okay, that can it can take so many different forms. So it's really helpful to help us guide you in figuring out where you want to go and kind of where you're at.
Faisal, do you have any?
So for this project, sort of Riya has been sort of instrumental from the get-go. So originally, last fall, I had an idea for this paper, and the first stage was, first of all, is there actually any evidence in the qualitative accounts? So I sort of told Riya, okay, let's see if we can find any information from the biographies of diplomats and so she spent the first couple of a month or so just digging through the diplomatic record. I was like, okay, you can go to this website. I don't know what's there. Just go find out. And then so she came back with a list of 30 or 40 different accounts. And then more recently, we sort of looked at historical diplomats. And so she's been going back and reading the biographies of Sam Adams and Benjamin Franklin and stuff like that to see whether or not, when they were stationed in France back in, 1804, did they actually help with trade or anything like that? And then after that, then the question is how can we try to quantify what we're finding in these sort of qualitative accounts? And then for that, then she sort of stepped up and sort of developed her skills to scrape data from websites and pull that into a spreadsheet. And then over the last month or so, she's been learning how to use Stata, so it's been sort of fun sort of conveying some of that stuff to her and teaching her about what is a fixed effect and how does that work and all that type of stuff. So, throughout the whole experience, Riya's been great in that respect of sort of wanting to learn new skills, and I think that's probably one of the more sort of valuable traits that you can express when you sort of are interested in becoming an RA, that you're open to sort of learning new skills. Sometimes that's just doing the grunt work and just reading up on stuff, but then collecting data, cleaning data, it's tedious, but it's one of those things that is useful to sort of know how to do.
Thank you. I think just for the sake of time, we'll move on to the Q&A part because we want to hear from the audience as well, questions. And maybe as you think about your questions, we will now give a take two on that question for Professor Dendere.
I think, the education on the continent, it's 54 countries, so there's a lot of diversity in what people are being taught. There's a book that was circulating recently from Zimbabwe, which was on religion, and it said in the book that boys are strong, boys are independent thinkers, boys are clearer thinkers. And it said girls are emotional, girls are needy, girls need guidance, girls are submissive. And what struck me is that this is so different from any education I ever got as a kid in the same country. And yet this is the education that is being given to kids. And that's why I think I struggled with that question, because I've been thinking a lot about what is changing in the school system. When I learned history, I learned absolutely nothing about the genocide in Zimbabwe. So it was in a college class in Oregon where a professor was talking about genocide in Zimbabwe, and I said, what genocide? And then I have a friend who's from the region who said, what do you mean you don't know? And now those children, and then kids in Zimbabwe today are learning about the genocide, which we never did. So I think there are these evolutions that are happening with education. And in some ways, social media has been very crucial. I think the younger generation, they know so much more about the world than we ever did. But perhaps there's some fundamentals, right, where propaganda is such a big deal, not just in Zimbabwe, but I think everywhere in the world, right, when it comes to history, where who are the heroes? Who, a kid growing up in Zimbabwe would think Zimbabwe is the most democratic country in the world, and that our elections are fine, and that there is nothing wrong with the elections. And so I think propaganda and how leaders or elites shape knowledge is pretty crucial. And it's not just unique to Zim. So that's why I kind of struggle with it, because I think there's a lot that's happening with like education in general, especially at like elementary level.
Thank you. Open up to questions to any of the panelists. And if it's a question that's more even towards the student researchers, we have them in audience so they can answer your questions.
I have a question I forgot who's on the edge of the panel.
Oh, Professor Ahmed.
For Professor Ahmed, I have a question for like the, the ambassadors in trade. How did you kind of determine whether that was like a causal relationship, that like ambassadors cause less trade, or a reverse causal relationship, like because our country has bad trade, we don't send an ambassador?
Thank you.
So the first way is sort of looking at like a vacancy. So we sort of look at periods in which there's already an existing trade ambassador, like a diplomatic relationship. And then we ask sort of like, when there is a vacancy, what happens to trade flows, right? And so we first of all established that there was a reduction in trade basically during a vacancy. Now, that's going to get sort of technical. Now that sort of like you might be worried that that might be endogenous with trade flows. So to the extent that you think that maybe the US government will fire a diplomat because he or she has not been doing a good enough job promoting trade. So the way that we deal with that is we sort of know that when there's a new president that comes into office, there's usually a lot of churning in the diplomatic corps. So we used the timing of a new president as sort of exogenous variation in the probability of a vacancy. And then we use that as like, again, like an instrumental variable. I don't know if you studied this stuff, to sort of gauge the effect of a vacancy on trade. And so then we established the same basic result there. The other sort of analysis that we do was sort of looking at whether or not individual ambassadors matter in terms of trade flows. We just sort of decompose the trade effect by looking at like country characteristics, and then we look at like the individual ambassador effect by basically having like a fixed effect, and then we just do a test of those effects to see whether or not they're different. Sorry that this became overly technical, but that's sort of how we try to establish those results causally.
And it's actually really fascinating that, I believe your research has not taken econometrics yet, and yet, it is possible to learn these things, but we all do encourage more statistical inference courses for you to take if you're interested in these types of causal links in the data. Any other questions?
Hi, I have a question for Professor Torres. Can you talk a little bit more about the types of peace building efforts that you're looking at on the ground, and kind of how those, or how you found correlations with violence or like violent outcomes?
Yeah, so the first question becomes, what is violence? And effectively, right, we focus on conflict-related violent outcomes, in part because that's a lot of what the literature looks at, but also a lot of what literature reviews on this topic don't look at. So we focus particularly on battle-related deaths, conflict recurrence, and violence against civilians. So that's our dependent variable, right? And the independent variables that we're focusing on, so Similarly, there's not much consensus necessarily in the literature, at least from the approach that I study things from, on what constitutes peace building, because it's a very vague and kind of nebulous concept. So the first step sort of was developing what we're calling modalities of peace, which are like basically a long list of different activities that international peace building can take on. I suggest you take a look at the poster. I'm not going to summarize all of them here, but just to kind of give you the snapshot of it, basically we averaged some of the effects across different studies to determine whether or not there was a conflict reducing or a conflict, like some unintended consequences, so to speak, effect. And we find generally the most support that peacekeeping initiatives generally reduce conflict. There's a lot of nuance to that, though, and that governance reform, again, more nuance, but generally helps to reduce conflict as well. Yeah.
Thank you. What other questions? Yeah, Madalena, yeah, right. Yeah. Pass it along.
This is for anybody on the panel. I was just wondering where you might have seen your research produce some really good change, whether that's on a local scale or national, or just under any of you guys' projects.
Great question.
Well, the chocolate, I think I've seen a lot more people become interested in the origins of chocolate. I've seen very local improvements in chocolate consumption on campus, increase in chocolate consumption. But also people really wanting to buy chocolate from African chocolatiers. I wish I had the guts to be on TikTok, because apparently everybody is doing TikTok and talking about like cocoa nibs and all these things and giving wrong information. Sometimes citing my research or not. I wish I was braver, because then I could go on and be like, well, actually, this is what you can do with cocoa nibs. These are the benefits. But I do think there is some interest in learning more about the origins of chocolate. And the fact that the cacao fruit, which you see there, which looks absolutely nothing like chocolate, right? You probably thought it looks chocolatey. It's not. It's whitish inside. And that it can be used for many other things other than like chocolate that we eat. So thinking about shea butter, juice, and then you see the brown that I'm holding, that's like the cocoa, the seed, right? And when you crack it open, just a very small part of that is used for making chocolate. You can use it for making black soap, all of these things. So I don't think it's just my research, but I think there is a lot more interest in what that entire plant can give to the rest of the world.
So I'll say something. I mean, I've been doing this since the elections of 2008. And in our beginnings, we started discovering that there were political bots on Twitter, and that misinformation was crossing over different platforms. And our research at that time actually was part of, then started a movement about social media and misinformation in social media around elections. And like I'm talking 2010, 2012. And over time that grew and it became something important, and people then started putting mechanisms in place. Like, for example, Twitter at some point had a trust and safety team that was all about how do we maintain integrity of information online. And you might remember that eventually Trump at some point got all his accounts by social media terminated because of spreading misinformation. But oh, how much the world changed. And now all these companies dismantled all these groups, and now the tech bros that own them, right? Now they can do whatever they want, right? So even in those times when researchers was able to bring to the front of the public attention something that was important, and peer pressure or public pressure made so that these companies put mechanism in place. If the political environment, the entire political environment and people in power, right, don't make this change permanent or don't put legislation in place so that this becomes something that it's not at the will of these company owners, right? And now we have like total chaos, and probably it'll take a while until we go back to having these teams in place again. Not very optimistic, I know, but it's hard right now to find hope out there in social media. And to go back to kids being educated about, like, oh my goodness, like treadwives, do you guys have heard? Yes, right, like that is happening right now, and they are taking over social media with their vision of what women should be and where their role in society is.
Anyone else?
I'll chime in really quickly. So not this particular research, but I've previously done some large-scale surveys with members of militaries in different countries around the world. And basically the focus of those surveys was to basically understand kind of the experiences of women in the military in particular, and like what barriers exist for their meaningful inclusion in the military and stuff like that. And you know, there's one thing to be said for having the opportunity to do a big survey like that, but I think there's something also to be said for the way how we did the surveys, in that we ran these huge surveys, and then there were teams of researchers who went to the different countries that we surveyed and presented to members of the military, like, here's what we found. And that actually led to some really interesting focus group-like type discussions between male and female members of the military, in which they were able to talk amongst themselves, kind of sex disaggregated, and then come back together and kind of highlight for each other their experiences, and also tell us as researchers if our surveys were capturing their actual true experiences. So it was a pretty cool and interesting and unique experience, but I think there's something to be said for, like, not even just the output of research, but sometimes the process of doing it. That can be illuminating, I guess, at the very least.
Yeah, and even though I'm not a panelist moderator, but I do research also. So, and this is, I just can't not say something that right now in the moment, it seems very discouraging, you know, like just the way that things are, right? And it takes, for research to make impact, it takes policymakers to actually pick it up, right, and push it forward. Researchers can really only do that much. We present it, you know, we show how important it is, and, you know, it needs to be actually then implemented. But I work on diversity and gender gaps and inequality in general in the labor market. And, you know, we're seeing a lot of like companies who are no longer, you know, required essentially by, like, you know, federal, by policymakers to, like, promote, you know, DEI initiatives. Like, they're all kind of scaling back, right? And but this is when the research is the most important, right? Is to present that actually diversity improves outcomes, improves, right? And it takes, like, one company at a time, one CEO at a time, one, you know, so I actually think even during these hard times, it's even that much more important, and not to give up. And if it's not gonna come from the government level, it has to come from the private sector too. So there are ways to actually also push it forward, not just in government, but through, like, more private impacts. Yeah. Well, thank you. Thank you very much. This was incredible. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you for everybody who came here. Big round of applause.